Welcome back. This one comes from Kyoto, lantern alleys, quiet shrines, and a photo that erased a lover. A man held up a picture of himself and his girlfriend under cherry blossoms. When it developed, he was standing alone. Locals whisper about yūrei, spirits bound by grief, haunting bridges and mossy steps. Stay with me. Tonight isn't one ghost story, it's two. A love that can't walk in daylight, and a widow whose home is a tomb. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what the photo and the house were trying to warn him about. Andrew was 31, an American teacher who had left behind the rush of Chicago streets and the restless pressure of deadlines for something quieter. Friends had teased him when he announced he was moving to Kyoto. They imagined a man in midlife crisis, running off to a city of shrines and cherry blossoms like some romantic film cliché. But Andrew knew it wasn't an escape. It was a pursuit. He wanted stillness, a life where the mornings didn't begin with horns and sirens, but with the low ring of temple bells. He wanted evenings not drowned in television glow, but lit by lantern fire. The air scented with bamboo smoke instead of exhaust fumes. His job teaching English was a practical anchor, but beneath it ran another desire: to find himself again by learning a rhythm older and slower than anything he had known. Each morning, he cycled through narrow lanes, the smell of fresh tatami drifting from carpenters' shops, the cries of children in uniforms bouncing off tiled roofs. His students, teenagers half curious, half shy, asked him in careful English, "Why come here?" Andrew would smile, tap his chest, and answer, "For peace." They didn't always understand, but they nodded solemnly, as if guarding his secret. In the afternoons, when the lessons ended, he didn't go straight home. He wandered. Kyoto invited drifting, as though the city wanted to be discovered slowly, turn by turn, corner by corner. His apartment was small, the kind of place that would have seemed claustrophobic in Chicago, but here felt like part of the story. The floorboards groaned with every step, and the paper walls allowed his neighbors' coughs to seep through at night. Yet Andrew felt no irritation. These sounds reminded him he wasn't alone. Some evenings he thought of it as a kind of chorus, the house itself humming with age. Outside, the street narrowed to a lantern alley, where red paper globes swayed gently in the wind, casting ripples of shadow on walls darkened by centuries. He would pause under them, notebook in hand, scribbling broken lines. Lantern alley, bamboo wind, footsteps on stone. It wasn't poetry, not really, but it was proof he was paying attention. Kyoto was full of textures, and Andrew wanted to memorize them all. The Kamogawa River where herons skimmed the surface at dusk, Nishiki Market with its mix of incense smoke and frying oil, tiny bars hidden like secrets between wooden facades where a foreigner could drink sake and trade polite nods without words. He wanted to know which vending machine dispensed the strongest canned coffee, which shrine bell echoed longest, which alley caught the morning sun. His purpose was simple: to belong. Not as a tourist with a camera, but as someone whose footsteps blended into the city's rhythm. He hoped that one day the old grocer would greet him by name, that the neighborhood children would wave without hesitation. He wanted his presence to matter, in the small way that quiet lives matter. But what struck Andrew most was the way shrines appeared everywhere. At first, he thought of them as landmarks for tourists, charming backdrops for photographs. Then one of his colleagues explained, over tea, a shrine is not just decoration, it is a boundary between gods and humans, between this world and the other. The words lingered with him. He began to bow when passing, even if no one was around, feeling the air shift subtly as if acknowledging something unseen. He realized shrines weren't just places, they were thresholds. Every offering of flowers, every curl of incense smoke was both a greeting and a warning. It was at one such shrine, tucked behind mossy stone steps in the Higashiyama district, that he saw her. Miko. She stood with quiet poise, placing fresh chrysanthemums into a small clay cup at the base of the gate. Her hair fell like ink over her shoulders, her movements as deliberate as a ritual. Andrew almost walked past, not wanting to intrude, but she looked up. Her eyes caught him, gentle but heavy with something unspoken, as if she carried the weight of forgotten years. He bowed clumsily, muttered a greeting in Japanese. She tilted her head, then switched to English with soft precision. "Evening walk?" It was a question and an invitation in one breath. Andrew nodded, and that moment became the first thread of something that would change his life. Their meetings were never arranged, but somehow inevitable. In the following evenings, he would wander Kyoto's alleys and find her there, sometimes tending the shrine, sometimes walking with no clear destination, sometimes simply standing in the glow of lanterns as though waiting for him. They didn't exchange phone numbers or make promises. Instead, they built a rhythm, a ritual of presence. Andrew would share pieces of his day: the student who made a joke in perfect English, the vending machine coffee that tasted like syrup, the loneliness that faded with every step through these streets. Miko listened, offering short replies, her words carefully chosen, almost cautious. When she did speak at length, it was always about the city itself. "Kyoto remembers more than people think," she told him once, her gaze fixed on the moss-covered stones. "Every step here is part of a story." Andrew found himself looking forward to those walks more than anything else. They weren't dramatic or romantic in the Hollywood sense. There were no sweeping declarations, no staged gestures. There was only the quiet comfort of companionship, the sound of another pair of footsteps echoing alongside his own, the soft exchange of whispers as the city hushed around them. In Miko's presence, silence felt as natural as speech. He didn't need to explain why he had come to Kyoto. She seemed to understand, or perhaps she simply didn't ask, and that was its own kind of understanding. Some evenings they followed the lantern alleys, where red light turned their shadows into long, wavering figures that merged and separated with each step. Other times they walked toward the bamboo groves. When the wind rushed through the stalks, the sound was like voices. Low, overlapping, impossible to decipher. Andrew sometimes paused, struck by the sensation of being watched, but never in a threatening way. Instead, it felt like the city itself was observing, acknowledging him. Miko never seemed disturbed by these moments. She would only smile faintly, as though the wind was confirming something she already knew. In this way, Andrew's life in Kyoto became both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in the sense of routine, teaching, cycling, shopping at the market, returning to his small creaking apartment. Extraordinary in the way that every corner of the city seemed alive, holding stories just beyond reach, and in the quiet companionship of a woman whose presence was both soothing and enigmatic. He sometimes wondered why Miko appeared when she did, why their paths aligned so perfectly, but he never asked. He accepted her presence as one accepts the turning of the seasons. To anyone watching, his life would have seemed unremarkable. A foreign teacher exploring his new city, befriending a local woman, finding solace in small rituals. And that was precisely what made it powerful. It was relatable. It could happen to anyone. A man seeking a quieter life. A stranger welcomed, in small ways, into a city older than his imagination. A gentle connection formed not through fireworks, but through the slow accumulation of shared moments. On nights when he returned home after walking with Miko, Andrew often lay awake listening to the house creak and the faint wind rattling the paper walls. Instead of loneliness, he felt a strange comfort, as though the city itself had accepted him. He thought of shrines not as boundaries, but as reminders, that life existed on both sides of the veil, and sometimes the veil was thinner than he realized. He didn't dwell on it, not yet. He only smiled, closed his eyes, and promised himself that tomorrow evening he would walk again, perhaps find Miko again, perhaps learn a little more about the city that was slowly becoming part of him. In those early months, Kyoto gave Andrew exactly what he believed he had come for: a quieter life. He didn't yet know that every step deeper into its alleys, every whispered word with Miko at the shrine, was guiding him towards something waiting on the other side of that boundary. Andrew never noticed the first sign until it was already too late to ignore. In the quiet of that wooden house, where tatami mats carried the faint smell of rice straw and smoke drifted from neighbors' kitchens, he thought peace had finally found him. The countryside air was soft, almost forgiving, and the slow rhythm of days felt like a cure for everything restless inside him. He told himself that here, in this place, he could start again. Yet the house, or perhaps what lived in it with him, had other intentions. It began with something so small he laughed it away. A teacup, plain porcelain with a thin crack running through its rim, moved across the table when he wasn't looking. He had left it near the center, far from the edge, but when he returned to tie his shoes, the cup had inched forward as if some invisible hand had nudged it closer to a fall. He froze for a second, then shook his head. Houses like this warped with the seasons. The woods swelled in rain, the floor tilted just enough to send things sliding. That had to be it. He lifted the cup, drank the last of the cold tea, and told himself not to be dramatic. Later, he found a book on the desk open to a page he hadn't yet reached. He was sure he had stopped at 70, dog-earing the corner before blowing out the candle. But the book sat now at 142, where the story spoke of longing, distance, and the ache of separation. The pages fluttered though the air was still. Andrew pressed his lips together and told himself it was nothing. Maybe he had read ahead, half asleep and forgotten. That happened. Memory wasn't always trustworthy. The mind created its own ghosts if you let it. But Miko was harder to explain. When she walked across the wooden floorboards, her steps left no sound. Everyone else made the timber sigh, Andrew himself, the neighbors when they visited, even the small children who ran across the porch. The house always complained. But Miko, she was weightless. She appeared beside him without a trace, without warning, as though the air had parted to let her through. The first time it happened, he almost dropped the kettle. Her presence had startled him so completely that his heart thudded against his ribs. She simply smiled, serene, her dark hair falling over one shoulder. "You walk so quietly," Andrew managed to say. His voice cracked, and he forced a laugh to cover it. "I don't want to disturb," Miko answered softly. It was a considerate reply, a gentle one, and Andrew let himself believe it. Some people were light on their feet. Maybe she had grown up in a household where silence was prized. Maybe she was graceful by nature. He told himself that was all. Yet in the nights that followed, he began to notice more. Her shoes left no prints near the door, no matter how wet the ground outside. When she crossed a room, the oil lamp's flame didn't flicker, as if even air refused to shift around her. She was present, yet absent, touching, yet untouchable. Andrew swallowed these thoughts and locked them away. She was with him, and that was all that mattered. One evening under the cherry blossoms, petals drifting like soft snow, he wanted to capture the moment. He lifted his camera, the one he had carried across cities, through borders, through years. Miko stood beside him, a crimson scarf wrapped around her neck, her face calm and radiant. He pressed the shutter, the click loud in the still night. She smiled, and he thought to himself that if time stopped here, he would not mind. The next day, when the photograph developed, Andrew's stomach turned to ice. He stared at the print, waiting for her image to bloom on the paper. But only his own face appeared, smiling, eyes squinting at the light. His shoulders stood square, his hand half raised as though holding someone else's. But there was no one, only empty air beside him. Panic crawled through him. He developed another print, then another. Still, she was missing. He remembered the weight of her scarf brushing his arm, the warmth of her standing so close the scent of sakura clung to his shirt. She had been there. He knew she had, yet the camera refused to acknowledge her. Andrew tried to laugh it off. Maybe the film is bad, he muttered. Maybe the exposure failed. But when he showed Miko the empty photograph, she didn't blink, didn't frown. She looked at it with calm eyes and said, "Some things can't be captured on film." Her voice was steady, her smile so natural that Andrew felt ashamed of his doubt. He slid the photograph into a drawer and told himself never to bring it up again. Days moved, but unease shadowed them. He began to wake in the middle of the night, to find the shoji doors cracked open, though he remembered sliding them shut. The cold air seeped in, and when he looked out, Miko often stood in the garden, her figure still beneath the moonlight, staring at the pond. The water's surface never rippled, though the wind bent the trees. When he whispered her name, she turned with a slow grace, as though his voice had travelled across a great distance. Then she walked back inside, slipping under the covers with a smile that erased all protest from his lips. "She's restless," he told himself. That's all. But a part of him noticed something he refused to voice. In all those nights under the pale light, she never blinked. Neighbours began to mutter. At the market, an old man leaned close and whispered, "She doesn't cast much of a shadow." Andrew forced a laugh, cheeks burning. "It's just the light." Yet later, when clouds hung heavy and every villager's shadow stretched black against the ground, Miko's was faint, pale, sometimes gone altogether. Andrew looked once, twice, then stopped himself from checking again. To look was to admit, and to admit was to risk losing her. The silence grew heavier. His sleep frayed. He dreamed of earth, damp and raw, clinging to his hands as though he had dug all night. He woke sweating, reaching for Miko, only to find her side of the futon cold. Yet when morning came, she was always there again, hair neatly arranged, lips curved in the smallest smile. He began to fear his own reflection. One dawn, bending over the polished basin, he saw himself staring back, pale, tired, human. Over his shoulder stood Miko, smiling with those steady, patient eyes. His heart leapt. He turned in panic. The room was empty. Andrew's breath came short, and for the first time he admitted to himself what his excuses had been hiding. The house was not haunted. He was. And the haunting wore the face of the woman he loved. Still, he whispered to the silence, convincing himself against the dread. "She's real. She loves me. That's enough." But you hearing this now feel the warning more sharply than he ever did. Teacups do not move on their own. Books do not read themselves. Footsteps do not vanish in silence. Shadows do not disappear. And no lover smiles at you from a photograph where she never appeared. The signs were there, written into every moment, and Andrew refused them all. That is how hauntings work. Not with thunder, not with knives, but with whispers. They creep through ordinary days until the ordinary no longer holds. And so, the audience knows what Andrew cannot yet admit. Some loves bless you, and others bind you. The first time it happened, Andrew dismissed it as nothing more than the wind. He had been climbing the moss-stained stone steps leading to a small shrine hidden off one of Higashiyama's narrow lanes. The torii gate above him was peeling red lacquer, its wood tired but enduring, and the stone lanterns that lined the path were softened by generations of weather. He paused halfway, catching his breath, when he heard the faintest sound. The wooden prayer plaques, Ima, knocking together. At first, the clatter seemed random, the idle music of wood moving against wood. But as he listened, he realized it was a pattern. Tap, pause, tap, tap. The rhythm felt deliberate, almost as if it were matching the beat of his own heart. Yet when he glanced up at the trees, their branches hung still. The camphor leaves didn't stir. The pines were statues. There was no wind to explain it. He told himself Kyoto was old, and old places had ways of unsettling outsiders. With a shrug, he continued upward, the sound fading behind him but echoing in his chest long after. The second time came a few days later, when spring was in full bloom and Maruyama Park was a drifting sea of cherry blossoms. Andrew walked along the Philosopher's Path, the famous canal walk where scholars once meditated as they strolled, now thronged with tourists and young couples. The ground was carpeted with pink and white petals, soft as paper. As he moved forward, he noticed something uncanny. The petals behind him seemed to rearrange themselves, not randomly, not carried by wind, but sliding into faint outlines that echoed the shape of his steps. For a moment, he saw a pale trail following exactly where his feet had been, as if the blossoms were remembering him. He froze, turned around, and blinked. The trail had disappeared. Just ordinary petals again, stirred slightly by a passing jogger. The jogger, oblivious, ran on, earbuds tucked in, unconcerned by the strangeness underfoot. Andrew kept walking, telling himself his imagination had filled in the rest, but a seed of unease lodged deeper inside him. The third time came at a kisetten, one of those dimly lit old coffee shops where Showa-era decor still lingered. The wooden counter gleamed with decades of polish, and an ancient radio perched on a shelf played faint, nostalgic music. Andrew sat with a steaming cup, listening when the sound cracked. The singer's crooning voice split, layered, multiplied, like several recordings of the same song were playing at once, slightly out of sync. The effect was unsettling, a chorus of voices where there should have been only one. He leaned closer, trying to catch words, but could only discern the rhythm. Careful, careful, careful. Then, as if nothing had happened, the voices collapsed back into a single song. The barista, unfazed, wiped a glass and asked if he wanted another blend. Her tone was cheerful, normal, as though nothing strange had happened at all. Andrew nodded, keeping his unease locked behind a polite smile. Kyoto had its mysteries, he thought. Maybe he was just sensitive to them. Over the next week, the disturbances became a pattern. Every morning he climbed those shrine steps on his way to work, and every morning the EMA knocked in the same rhythm. He tried ringing the shrine bell once, tugging the thick rope so that the clapper swung inside. He felt the movement, heard the dull thud of wood striking bronze, but there was no sound. The bell swallowed itself whole, leaving only a vibration deep in his ribs, a note too silent for air, but loud enough for his bones. He mentioned it once to Yuki, the woman at the stationery shop who always recommended pens and notebooks with a smile. She laughed softly when he told her. Some bells are shy in the morning, she teased. But as she tied the paper band around his notebook, her hands lingered. Her eyes flicked to the window, then back to him, as though she was hiding something behind her smile. He wasn't sure whether to laugh with her or keep quiet. Soon, it wasn't just at the shrine. At the laundromat, the washing machines all thudded in unison, their rhythm uncannily similar to the EMA's knocks. At the convenience store, the lottery booth was closed, a handwritten sign taped to the glass. Maintenance. Beneath the words, someone had traced a faint vertical line of sakura petals. Andrew touched one. It was fresh, soft, fragrant. But when he lifted it, the smell was not floral. It was incense, the kind burned endlessly at temple altars. Later, at home, He noticed his mirror had caught something it shouldn't. Not his reflection, but the suggestion of a woman standing beside him. Black hair pinned high in an old-fashioned style, kimono pale as dawn, expression calm and unreadable. He spun around, but the room was empty. The mirror, when he looked again, showed only himself. Still, he stopped trusting mirrors after that. Reflections felt like doors left ajar. Kyoto was a city full of doors. Stone guardians stood everywhere. Jizo statues clothed in red bibs and beads, protectors of children and travelers. Andrew found himself leaving coins at their feet without knowing why. Each offering left his palm colder than the last, as though unseen fingers brushed him, counting. The priest at the shrine, a man whose face was carved with the patience of cedar wood, told him gently not to disturb the steps. "Guests are welcome," the priest said, "but please, do not dig near the stairs." Andrew hadn't mentioned digging. The priest bowed, closing the subject with courtesy that sounded final. Nights grew heavier. At his apartment near the Kamo River, the wind chime above his window began ringing at odd hours, even when tied still with string. Its rhythm was unmistakable, the same beat of the ima, the same absence from the bell. One evening, Andrew traced the rhythm on his table with his finger and realized the strokes resembled a kanji. I. Love. He thought it coincidence, but when he wrote the character on a slip of paper and left it under a glass, he found it smeared the next morning, not outward like spilled ink, but inward, pulled to a single vanishing point. He tried confiding in a co-worker during lunch. Between steaming bowls of udon and the chatter of chopsticks, he told the story awkwardly, stumbling over words that sounded like superstition. His co-worker smiled, dismissing it. "You've been reading too many ghost tales," he said, then suggested Andrew visit a shrine festival. For distraction, Andrew went. The festival was loud, cheerful, lanterns glowing, children laughing. But beneath the noise, the ground seemed to hum, a low vibration like grief. He watched as the priest rang the bell, and this time the sound boomed for everyone, except him. To his ears, the silence was absolute. He left without touching his taiyaki. Kyoto tightened its grip on him. At Pontocho Alley by the river, lanterns glowed in the dark. Andrew stared at the water and saw her again, clearer this time. A woman in a pale kimono patterned with falling rain, lips forming his name. The current broke her reflection apart. Around him, couples laughed, bicycles passed, and taxis hummed. No one noticed. He bought a notebook and began documenting each occurrence. The more he wrote, the more the events aligned. The iema, the petals, the layered voices, the shadows. He developed photos of the shrine, frame after frame. On the third day, a sleeve appeared in the corner of one shot. On the fourth, the sleeve shifted uphill. On the fifth, it was gone. He showed them to Yuki. She handled them delicately, her silence deeper than words. Finally, she said, "Film can be temperamental," and handed them back wrapped in paper, as if they were fragile bones. By then, the city itself seemed complicit. The electronic voice at a crosswalk stuttered, repeating itself like an echo. A subway announcement hiccuped, layering station names as though caught in memory. Even neighborhood flyers bore marks of repetition, times underlined twice, erased hearts redrawn in pencil. Repetition became ritual. Ritual became invitation. At night, mist pooled at the shrine steps, thick as breath, curling low against the stone. Andrew recognized the rhythm now, no longer warning, but calling. The iema clicked in time. The silent bell weighed his chest. Somewhere, a radio voice layered itself into a single word. Here. He placed the photograph he had found, of the woman on the steps, at the base of the shrine, tucking its corner under a stone. Then he bowed, clapped, and spoke her name, softly but clearly. Miko. The mist thickened. wrapping his ankles like a cold hand. The steps seemed to lean forward, listening. Kyoto held its breath. Andrew realized the city had been drawing him closer all along, guiding him through repetition, pulling him into its memory. He did not dig. He did not run. He stayed, standing between worlds, waiting. The Emma clicked once, twice, like a reply, and then the air pressed against him, layered with voices not his own. For the first time, the silence broke, not outside, but inside his chest. A bell that had been mute for weeks rang faintly within him, as if struck by a hand across decades. The sound was small, but it was real. And Andrew understood that the next breath he drew would not be like the last. The bamboo forest was no longer just trees. It was a maze of green and shadow, each stalk bending with unnatural rhythm, as if breathing with him, as if waiting for him to falter. Satoshi stumbled forward, clutching the lantern that sputtered weakly in his hand, its flame shrinking against the damp breath of the night. The path had twisted again, doubled back on itself, and yet somehow carried him deeper, always deeper. The old woodcutter's voice echoed in memory, a whisper rasping against the back of his mind. Do not go deeper. The forest takes what it wants. But he had already gone too far. Curiosity had carried him, and now something stronger, invisible, was pulling him closer to the shimmering outline of the house that flickered like a mirage among the stalks. The house glowed faintly as though its walls were made of translucent bone. Its paper doors pulsed with light, dim and pale, like veins seen under the skin. Every step Satoshi took grew heavier, as if invisible weights were shackled to his ankles. The air pressed in against his chest, damp and suffocating, and even the act of breathing burned his lungs. He tried to shake it off, tried to tell himself he was imagining it, but the forest allowed no such lie. For in that silence, when even the crickets had fled, another sound began. It started low, like wind dragging across broken reeds, but wind did not echo in time with the heartbeat pounding inside his skull. This sound did. A moan, ragged, dragging, swelling, until it became a chorus of voices, overlapping, rising and falling in a rhythm too steady to be natural. Satoshi's grip tightened on the lantern. He lifted it, and the thin flame revealed faces between the bamboo. At first he thought they were carved masks, offerings left to rot in the mist. But the longer he stared, the more he realized they moved. They shifted, eyes rolling in hollow sockets, mouths straining wide, stitched open with strands of shadow. He gasped, recognizing them. Faces he had glimpsed on the road, travelers and merchants gone missing months ago. Their bodies were gone, but their faces had been claimed, bound to the forest itself, and every eye, every hollow, fixed on him. His hand trembled. The lantern dropped, oil splashing across the earth. The flames snuffed out in an instant, as if the forest itself swallowed fire. Darkness collapsed like a shroud. He spun, searching for the path, for any sign of escape, but the bamboo closed tighter, stalks leaning, interlocking, a cage that groaned with the weight of unseen pressure. Then she appeared. The widow in white stepped from the house. Her bare feet touched no grass, her form floating inches above the earth. At first she was beautiful, skin smooth as porcelain, eyes lowered in grace, robes flowing like river water. But then the porcelain cracked. Thin lines spidered across her cheeks, her forehead, her neck, glowing faintly with a pale blue light. The cracks widened until flesh split, and beneath it was no flesh at all but something dark, something hollow. Her jaw unhinged, bones bending farther than human limits, and teeth emerged, long, thin, needle-sharp, gleaming wet in the faint glow. She raised her head and screamed. The scream shattered the night. It was not one voice, but hundreds, layered over each other. The voices of men and women and children. Every cry of fear, every last plea for mercy torn from those who had vanished here. The sound pressed against Satoshi's skull, rattling his bones until blood trickled from his nose, until his ears rang as if drums beat inside them. He dropped to his knees, hands clapped over his head, but the sound crawled beneath his skin, inside his mind, ripping thoughts apart like paper. The bamboo responded. Stalks shook violently, though no wind stirred. Faces stretched, mouths opening wider, and from the shadows between them came crawling hands, disembodied, grey, clawed fingers, dragging themselves forward on wrists that ended in nothing. They slithered up the stalks, scratched grooves into the wood, and then launched at him all at once. Satoshi tried to move, to scramble backward, but they were faster. Cold hands seized his arms, his legs, his chest, ripping cloth, cutting flesh. Each touch burned like frost and fire at once, freezing blood inside his veins while searing his nerves raw. He screamed, but the forest swallowed the sound, leaving only the widow's chorus. One hand latched onto his face, forcing his eyes upward. He looked into hers. They were golden, not the warmth of sunlight, but the sickly gleam of lantern light drowned in swamp water. Coins sunk in a riverbed, round and unblinking, glowing from deep inside. She blinked and the glow flared, searing his sight until the world blurred. Her sleeves spread wide, impossibly long, stretching outward like wings. From the folds, more hands slipped free, multiplying, dozens upon dozens, until the air shimmered with movement. The sound of claws against bamboo screamed in his ears like iron nails dragged across stone. She drifted closer, and her mouth opened wider, wider still, until it was no longer a mouth, but a cavern of shadow lined with razors. Satoshi clawed at the necklace around his neck. The prayer bead his mother had pressed into his palm before he left Kyoto. A cedar bead, carved with care. He clutched it tightly, whispering prayers, but his voice came thin and brittle, each word breaking apart before it left his lips. The widow's laughter broke through, soft at first, then louder, rippling like water poured into iron. It was almost beautiful, almost, until it split into shrieks. Her hand pierced through his chest, not breaking skin, not tearing cloth, but slipping straight through as if his body was smoke. Yet he felt it. Cold fire exploded inside him, spreading through veins, curling around his heart. His heartbeat slowed, each thud a fraction weaker. His breath hitched. The cedar bead cracked in his palm. Splinters dug into his skin. It could not protect him. Nothing could. He gasped, the air tearing at his throat, his lungs collapsing as though the forest itself refused to let him breathe. His vision swam. The bamboo faces leaned closer, hollow eyes deepening, widening, opening into voids. The earth beneath him softened. His knees sank an inch, then two. He looked down. The soil had turned black, slick and thick as tar, sucking him deeper with each movement. He clawed at the ground, nails ripping, but every pull dragged him further down. The widow hovered above, her laughter rising, her claws dragging against the inside of his chest. He could not move, he could not scream. The forest mourned, or perhaps rejoiced. Each stalk of bamboo creaked forward, bending like mourners leaning over a grave. But this was no mourning. This was imprisonment. They were bars, and he was already trapped within them. He thought of Kyoto, the city lights glowing at dusk, the chatter of the market, his mother's hand pressing the cedar bead into his palm. All of it was slipping away, fading like smoke. The widow's face filled his vision, her eyes golden suns burning holes in his soul. Her mouth gaped wide enough to swallow him whole. The soil reached his waist, his chest. He fought, struggled, but the tar pulled harder. His body sank, and with it, his strength. The hands clung tighter, dragging him down as though desperate to keep him company in the dark. His last scream tore from his throat, a sound too weak to reach the treetops. The forest drowned it. replacing it with her chorus. The widow lowered her face to his, so close he felt the chill of her breath. Her cracked porcelain lips curved into a smile, the kind of smile that pretends at kindness while hiding the blade. "You came too far," the voices whispered, every stolen soul speaking through her mouth. "Now you belong to us." The tar surged. His chest sank beneath it. His arms locked. The prayer bead crumbled in his hand. The forest tilted, and the last thing Satoshi saw before the blacks swallowed his eyes was the widow's golden stare, burning, unblinking, a lantern guiding him not home, but into endless night. Satoshi's legs trembled as he pushed away from the low table, the warmth of the tea still clinging to his hand, even though his bones felt like they had been filled with ice. The house glimmered faintly in the moonlight, yet its silence was not the silence of the living. It was too deep, too heavy, the kind of silence that listens rather than rests. He had thought, foolishly, that this widow's home was a refuge, a place where a traveller might sit, share tea, and escape the exhaustion of long roads. But now, watching her face shift in the slanted glow, he knew the truth. Her eyes had hollowed into dark sockets. Her lips turned the colour of bruised sky, and her skin had thinned until it looked ready to tear like old paper. He told himself it was nothing but moonlight, nothing but fatigue, the tricks of a tired body. But the words felt hollow even as he whispered them. The widow tilted her head, as if she had overheard his denial not with her ears, but with whatever lay behind those bottomless eyes. Her lips curved into a faint smile, too calm, too certain. "You are tired," she breathed, the words as soft as smoke, yet heavy as stone. "Stay. Rest. No one leaves the forest once it has chosen them." Satoshi's throat tightened. He wanted to answer, but his tongue had grown heavy, his mouth dry. The tea that had slid so easily down now burned in his stomach with a cold fire, as if it had never been brewed from leaves but from something far more ancient. He turned toward the paper door. What had seemed a step away now stretched into a long corridor, like the house itself had grown around him. He forced his body forward. The mats whispered under his feet as if someone else walked in tandem, a presence rising without sound. He shoved the screen open with both hands. The paper ripped under his palms, and cold air rushed in. The night forest yawned wide, bamboo stalks crowding together like sentries. He stumbled out, his chest hammering, the air sharp with damp earth and crushed leaves. Behind him, he felt the weight of the house, as if it leaned forward, watching. He did not look back. He could not. He ran. The path twisted, no longer the gentle trail that had led him here, but a snare, winding in directions that made no sense. The bamboo swayed, though no wind stirred, their tall bodies creaking in unison, closing the sky above. He ran until his breath tore his throat raw, until his legs threatened to buckle. The ground sucked at his sandals, stones bruised his feet, branches whipped across his face, and still, beneath all the noise of his flight, her voice floated behind him, unhurried, unstrained, as though she needed no breath to follow. "You carry my shadow now," she whispered. "You cannot leave me." The sound pressed into his ribs, into the thrum of his heart. Something cold brushed his back, not the grasp of a hand, but the pull of a thread, as if unseen cords tried to reel him back into the house. He fell to his knees, palms sinking into mud that stank of incense and rot. His vision blurred. He tried to pray, to recall the words his grandmother had once taught him for nights when the road grew dangerous, for shrines tucked deep in mountains, for travellers afraid of what lurked past the lantern light. But the words scattered in his mind like birds startled from a branch. All that remained was a broken whisper. "Let me live." The forest gave him nothing but silence. Then ahead, a break in the stalks, a slope, faint moonlight slipping through. Hope flared, Desperate and reckless, he forced his legs forward, clawing at roots, stumbling, gasping. He burst into the clearing, slid down the slope, and saw in the distance the faint lights of Kyoto, lanterns in windows, hearth fires, the fragile glow of the living world. His chest heaved, his limbs burned, but the sight filled him with just enough strength to keep moving. Stones cut into his shins, branches tore his robes, but he did not stop. When at last he collapsed by a roadside shrine at the edge of town, dawn was breaking. Farmers found him crumpled in the dirt, half conscious, his skin clammy and his pulse weak. They carried him into Kyoto, called for a physician, laid him on mats in a small room where incense curled in gentler patterns. The doctors could find no fever, no wound, no disease. They told him to eat, to rest. Yet food filled his stomach without giving strength. Blankets warmed his skin but not his marrow, and every cup of tea he swallowed tasted of ash. Nights were worse. He woke drenched in sweat, heart hammering, convinced he had heard the mats whispering again, or the faint shuffle of sleeves across a doorway. In his dreams he sat once more across from the widow. Sometimes she was still beautiful, her voice patient. Sometimes her face crumbled into its hollow mask, her smile spreading like a wound. He would jolt awake gasping, certain that she had been leaning close enough to touch him, certain that her shadow had slipped back inside his body. Neighbours whispered that he had been cursed. Some said he had crossed into the wrong house, one meant for spirits, not men. Others claimed he had simply collapsed from exhaustion. Satoshi knew better. He felt the forest every time he tried to sleep. He felt the widow every time his breath turned shallow, and his chest clenched as though her fingers still pressed against his ribs. His reflection grew paler in bowls of water, blurred at the edges, as though he was becoming transparent. Weeks passed, but the weakness never left him. He learned to walk again, but each step stole more strength than it should. His hands, once steady enough to weigh and trade goods with confidence, trembled when he lifted even small bundles. A short walk left him gasping, sweat beading along his spine. He avoided bamboo groves, avoided houses with paper walls, avoided silence itself, because in silence he could hear her breathing. He lived, but the word carried a bitter taste. Survival was not freedom. He had escaped the forest, but the forest had not released him. Every time he passed a shrine, he pressed his palms together, begged protection from any spirit willing to listen. He left offerings of coins and food, whispered prayers into the smoke. But even then, he felt the thread pull, faint but unbroken. Sometimes at night, when the city lay quiet and his body throbbed with cold that no blanket could drive away, he felt the urge to return. Not desire, not longing, but a compulsion, as though half of him remained inside that house and the other half would never rest until he went back. It terrified him. He fought it with every breath, reminded himself of the lights of Kyoto, the warmth of shrines, the touch of living hands. Yet part of him understood. You cannot abandon a place that has already claimed you. You can only delay the moment it calls you back. Satoshi walked the streets like a man between worlds. His neighbours pitied him, then avoided him, uneasy at the pallor of his face and the shadows under his eyes. Merchants muttered that his goods carried bad luck. Children crossed the street rather than pass too near. He endured it all in silence, because what explanation could he give? That he had sat across from a widow whose house listened to his breath, that he had drunk tea brewed from shadow and bone, that he had run until his lungs tore but still felt her presence in every heartbeat. The scars were not visible, yet they weighed heavier than broken bones. At night, he dreamed of bamboo leaning inward, of a house that shimmered like a mirage, of a face that shifted with the moonlight. By day, he walked under the sun, but never felt warm. He lived with the constant knowledge that he had barely survived. and that survival itself might be temporary. And so Satoshi's story did not end with triumph. It ended with endurance, fragile, trembling, incomplete. He had abandoned the house, but he carried it within him. He had fled the widow, but her shadow clung to his back. He lived on, yes, but life was no longer what it once was. Each dawn he woke, knowing he had outrun death only to sleep beside it, that he had left the forest only for the forest to walk with him. And sometimes, when the wind rattled the shutters and the tea cooled too quickly in his cup, he thought he could hear her whisper again, "You cannot leave me." The air inside the widow's house thickened until it pressed on Satoshi's skin like damp cloth. His breath came shallow, ragged, as if every inhale had to fight through invisible weight. A cup of tea trembled in his hand. The chair across from him began to shudder and slide across the floor without a touch. The walls rippled like paper lanterns caught in water, and the shadows of the bamboo outside lengthened inward, stretching across the floorboards like fingers groping for his legs. It was no longer a house. It was breathing. Satoshi froze, rooted by both terror and disbelief. He had wandered far from the lights of Kyoto, drawn by rumours of a widow in white, by the shimmer of a house that seemed half real. He had ignored the old woodcutter's whisper at the forest's edge. "Do not go deeper. The forest takes what it wants." Now he understood. The warning was not metaphor. The forest had lured him here, into this place that shifted between worlds. A groan rose from beneath his feet. The tatami mats swelled upward like lungs filling with air. The house was alive, and it was feeding. His pulse hammered in his temples. He set the teacup down with shaking fingers, though even the porcelain trembled on its own, as if sliding toward an unseen mouth. He whispered to himself that it was exhaustion, that he had walked too long through the mist and lost his senses. But when the far wall dissolved into grey fog, showing him not wood and foundation stones but damp earth, he could no longer lie to himself. Beneath the floor, green moss covered rows of stones carved with fading kanji. They were not supports, they were grave markers. The truth arrived like an axe to the spine. The widow had not welcomed him into her home. She had led him into a tomb. A sound stirred at the threshold, the rustle of cloth. She appeared pale and calm, her white robe swaying without wind. In her arms, she carried something wrapped tightly in crimson silk. Her face was as it had always been, serene, too smooth, eyes both sad and empty. She knelt on the floor and placed the bundle gently between them, unwrapping one corner to reveal what looked like a ledger, its pages brittle and yellow with damp. She stroked its surface as if it were something living. "This is where they wait," she whispered. Satoshi's gaze fixed on the book. The ink shifted as if freshly written, words blooming across the page like flowers of blood. He leaned closer despite himself. The script was uneven, a mixture of neat brushstrokes and frantic scrawls, as if many hands had touched it across years. He read enough to understand. 3 centuries earlier, a plague had torn through this valley. Families fell in days, some in hours. Fearful survivors burned bodies, buried others in shallow graves, fled without marking the dead. This land was abandoned, cursed. Yet one woman returned, a widow who refused to leave the soil where her husband lay. She built her house above the graves, swearing that as long as she lived, he would not be alone. But vows bend when repeated long enough. Her devotion tangled with grief, and the dead multiplied. The house became a vessel, a bridge between the living and the buried. Over time, the structure and the tomb became one, a place that drew in wanderers, drained them, and kept their warmth inside its walls. The widow raised her head, and Satoshi saw not her lips, but the pages moving, the story spilling from both at once. "They came to me," she murmured, her voice overlapping itself like two echoes. Soldiers, merchants, travelers, all seeking shelter. And they stayed. The paper walls dissolved again. Beyond them, he saw figures kneeling in rows, faces blurred, half-transparent bodies bowed toward her as if in eternal prayer. Satoshi staggered backward, his heel striking a low table that had slid across the floor. Upon it lay offerings, bowls of rice, dried fish, and a cup of sake. But the rice writhed with worms, the fish bones gleamed bare, and the sake rippled like oil. This was no meal, it was tribute, food for the pact that bound the house to its inhabitants. The widow turned to him then, and her eyes caught the dim light like polished stone. She lifted the ledger, flipped to a page near the center, and traced one line with her finger. Satoshi's heart lurched. Written in dark, neat ink was his own name. He could not breathe. His voice failed, his throat scraped raw, but his mind screamed, "How?" He had only arrived tonight, a stranger from the city. Yet here was proof that the house had already claimed him. The widow's lips curved in a smile that carried neither cruelty nor mercy. "The forest writes the names," she said softly, "of those who cross its edge. Once you step inside, you belong." Memory knifed through Satoshi. The exhaustion that weighed heavier the deeper he walked, the shimmer of the house like a mirage, the woodcutter's broken voice. None of it had been coincidence. His path had been prepared, his arrival foretold. The ledger was no mere record. It was prophecy, inscribed by the house itself. He saw now what he had missed. The tea that warmed his hand but not his bones, because the house fed on his warmth even as he drank. The strength draining from his body step by step, because the forest siphoned life into its tomb. The widow's beauty, too still, too flawless, because she was not alive in the same sense as he was. She was both prisoner and priestess, the house's caretaker, and its voice. The objects that slid and shifted when he wasn't looking, the house reshaping itself, closing paths of escape. Every detail he had rationalized was in fact a warning. He had dismissed them, and now each returned sharpened, undeniable. The widow stepped closer. The fog thickened. From beneath the tatami, something brushed Satoshi's ankles, cold, moss-slick fingers pushing up through the cracks, urging him to kneel. He cried out, staggering against the wall, but the wall melted into shadow. Shadow became hands, reaching for his arms, his throat. All around him the graves pulsed with faint light, exhaling whispers in rhythm with his racing heart. The names in the ledger glowed faintly on the page, each a life devoured, each a soul folded into the house. His name shone brightest. He tried to force words through his dry lips. "I will not stay." The declaration broke into a rasp, powerless against the hush of the tomb. The widow tilted her head, pity softening her features. "No one leaves," she said, voice echoing with the hush of countless others. "You are already written." The ground convulsed. The tatami split, revealing moss-thick stone slabs, bones half buried in soil, skulls with mouths open as if breathing. The graves heaved in time with his pulse, drawing him closer, welcoming him into their rhythm. He stumbled, choking on fear, clutching at the last fragments of his will. The house loomed alive around him, a body made of stone and spirit, hungry with centuries of grief. The truth was complete now, seared into his mind with cruel clarity. This was not a home that held memories of the dead. It was a tomb that lured the living, drained them, and bound them forever. The widow knelt at the center of it all, the crimson bundle across her lap, her hands folded in prayer as if serene. Around her, the names in the ledger pulsed like stars, glowing faintly in the mist. Satoshi's name blazed at the top, sealing his fate. And as he stared, he realized the cruelest truth of all. Once you understood the nature of the house, once you recognized that it was a tomb pretending to be a sanctuary, it already owned you. Knowledge was not escape. Knowledge was the final lock on the door. The last image burned into his vision as the mist closed in, the house dissolving entirely into a field of graves, moss thick as velvet, stones breathing faintly like the chests of sleepers. Above them hovered the widow in white, her eyes dark pools that reflected nothing. The tomb had claimed another, and somewhere in the soil beneath, Satoshi felt his own breath joining the rhythm of the dead. What would you do if the night itself seemed to hold your name? If you stood at the edge of the forest and felt something cold still clinging to your skin, would you wait at the shrine for answers, or leave before the gates between worlds closed? In Japanese folklore, spirits known as yūrei are not free to wander at will. They linger where promises are broken, where blood was spilled without justice, or where the living refuse to honor the dead. That's why shrines, old bridges and groves at the edge of towns are often feared, not just as sacred spaces, but as boundaries where the human world thins. An unmarked grave beneath the moss, a vow whispered in despair. These are enough to anchor a soul forever. When Satoshi stumbled back to the lantern road, he left the house of the widow behind. Yet the forest claimed a part of him, as if survival came at the cost of belonging to two worlds. So, what do you think? Would you wait for the spirit's hand at the shrine, or flee tonight? Comment Blossom if you'd stay. Comment Bamboo if you'd leave. And subscribe so you don't miss the next true style Asian horror.